Hi everyone, welcome to the third module in AgEd 263, the history of U.S. and world agriculture. I'm still Dr. Smith, still a real-life human here on the Moscow campus, excited to help guide you through the remainder of this class. It was wonderful to watch your personal introductions. I had the opportunity to learn a lot more about each of you. There's a lot of variation in the people who are taking the class this spring, and they range from large-scale production agriculture backgrounds to little to no production agriculture background. I want to make sure before we go on in the class to note that you are just as apt to gain and learn in this class whether you have a production ag background or not, because all humans are needed in agriculture, and we're going to talk about that connection point for everyone. So while this is a class housed in the College of Agriculture in my agricultural education department, I'm very excited to have everyone who's from outside CALS as a part of this class as we make those connections and we talk about how agriculture affects everyone. So if there was any concern that you were at a disadvantage if you didn't grow up on a farm and ranch, don't worry. No ag background required for this class. This week, we're going to take a little bit of a step away from a timeline approach to agricultural exploration, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what farming systems are and how they work. So as we think through the rest of the semester, when we talk about a change from types of control in agriculture, we'll have some reference points to come back in. This week's quiz is largely based on an agricultural terms glossary that you'll find linked in the module page. So as we go on, really the question this week that we're going to answer is, what are the types of systems that produce agriculture, food, and natural resource products? So we're going to talk about systems and how we put agriculture into some different buckets and what those buckets are and how they're categorized. It will end with our first big assignment for you, which is to take one of the farming systems that's listed on the page linked in the weekly module and to do a little bit of a deeper dive. We'll explain that assignment at the end of this presentation. So there is a difference between a food system and a farming system. So as we talk about what that difference might be, a food system is everything from the planting of the seed or the breeding of the animal until not only consumption by the consumer, but also clear through the processing of any waste product. So it's everything from the thought or the initial cellular components of making food, in whatever fashion that is, clear through that being broken down and decomposed back into the raw nutrients. Now, the United Nations FAO is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and they're kind of the gatekeepers on how agriculture works across the globe. They set policy, they set out some really important sustainable development goals that we'll talk about later on in the semester, but they're kind of the gatekeeper on everything that has to do with food in agriculture. A farming system is how the things happen to produce that raw product. So farming systems are everything through the full production of that environment. So we have a little bit of a difference. The food system is broader because it encompasses everything after that product is ready. And a farming system is really going to be everything that gets the food or fiber produced. So those are kind of the difference. If you hear someone using them interchangeably, usually they're talking about a food system. Quite often we call food systems, or farming systems, food systems. So both of them are important. They are interconnected. We can't have a food system without a farming system because we have to produce the raw products. So let's talk about how we categorize those farming systems. If we say, what are the categories of agriculture? What are the types of farming systems that are out there? We're going to get a bunch of different answers based on who we ask. So for the purpose of this class, we're going to start by kind of examining how people categorize farming systems. And they really kind of put them into three big buckets. Some people come up with these really complicated farming systems, from traditional to commercial to perennial to cropping and mixed, depending on what you're producing and how you're producing it. We're not going to do anything this complicated. This is another one that talks about extensive and intensive farming systems. We need to know what both of those are, but I don't think that this model gets to all of the different types of farming systems either. This one talks about kind of a difference between processes and natural processes and organic and conventional. All of those things are important, but that's not the only ways we can categorize farming systems. So as we look at all of those models, plus a bunch of others that exist out there, there's going to be kind of some categories based on three things. The first is how the farming occurs. So those are differences in how we treat the land, the soil, the water, crops and animals, timing, seasonality, labor, environmental, human factors. It's how does the farming or ranching happen? The next category bucket is who controls or owns the farm. So who makes the decisions on what is produced, how it's produced, so how do they decide how the farming occurs? What is the difference between how that distribution of labor is, how is income produced, what is the priority, and who decides the priority of the farm? And then there's an easy category that is what is being farmed. That would be a difference between a rice farm and a peach orchard and a cattle operation. So those categories are really the three buckets that we can use to split agriculture into different parts. So how farming occurs, who controls or owns the farm, and what is being farmed. For this week and next week, we're really going to look through pretty in detail those first two buckets. We're not necessarily going to look at what is being farmed because there are a million different commodities, and that's a little bit a part of your final assignment for the class. So we'll get to this, but much later in the semester. So as we think about those ways that how farming can occur and who controls and owns the farm, let's break that down just a little bit more in each of those categories. So some examples of differences in how farming can occur could be extensive versus subsistence farming, which is about how many of the resources we use and how much we produce on the land. We might have some differences that are row crop versus vertical farming. That's how the plants are actually put into their growing medium. Row crop is in the ground. Vertical farming allows us to grow inside in containers and categorize them in a controlled environment. Organic versus conventional farming is the difference between what kinds of chemicals we're going to use on those crops. Organic meaning that we only use carbon-based chemicals on that crop, and conventional meaning that we can use synthetic chemicals on that crop. Some of these get misunderstood or differently understood. Sometimes we have an automatic perception that organic would be better than conventional. We might have a perception that organic is better because it has less of an impact on the environment. Well, that might not necessarily always be true once we dive deeper into what each of those terms mean. And there's a lot of things that are out there about people wanting to know more about how their farm works and how their food is produced. And so we're going to give you the opportunity to dive a little bit into those. Organic and conventional, row crop, vertical, extensive, subsistence are all options for you to pick to do your deep dive assignment on this week. Another one is irrigated versus dryland, and that's how we're going to use water, how we use the resource of water. And some of them are more appropriate based on the area and the geography and the soil type that farming is happening in. And the final one in this category, to kind of give you an example of how differences might happen in farm processes, would be an example of a till versus a no-till farming. Tilling would be turning up the entire field versus no-till, where we try to minimize the disruption of plant roots. Often these decisions are made because of where that farm is and how the soil is in those areas. So we have some differences in how farm processes might occur. We'll have about half of the categories that you can pick from this week are differences in farm processes. The other differences are based on who owns and works on the farm. So these are differences in ownership type and the distribution of labor and how income from the farming enterprise is prioritized and distributed. So those are categories of kind of how the farm works. So what the farm does and how the farm works. Some of these differences might be things like a cooperative, where a bunch of smaller farmers work together in order to pool their resources to get a better opportunity to buy raw goods at a cheaper price because they become a cooperative who can then buy them at a wholesale or a discounted rate. And then they pool all of their products that are produced so that they can sell those for a different rate. There's lots of great examples of cooperatives throughout the country. Authoritative is a way to control or own a farm, which essentially means that the people who are in control don't necessarily think through the people who are producing the products. So these are kind of our human rights violation areas. And this happens wildly throughout history, that there are a group of people in power that say, people who are lesser than me, produce my food. So we see that with serfdom, plantation, slavery, indentured servitude. There's a lot of examples in history, and this is where we get into the social side of how farming systems work. There's a lot of examples of some misuse of power between the groups that have the power and don't have to do the manual labor to produce agricultural products, and groups that have less power and are often misused in order to provide those products. And we see those examples, unfortunately, still in many places today. If you've had jarred garlic in the last 50 or so years, you've probably consumed a product that was produced through an authoritative standpoint, because much of the jarred garlic is produced through prison labor in some Southeast Asian countries. It's one of those really weird things that we don't think about as we consume those food products today, that a lot of our imported products can still be produced in an authoritative agricultural system. The next one is a smallholder farmer. About 80% of the farms in the world are considered a smallholder farmer. That means it is a small amount of land held by very few people, and typically the work that happens on that farm happens with individuals within a single family or a small extended family. So smallholder farmers are actually the largest number of farms on the planet. And when we talk about smallholder farmers, 60 to 80% of smallholder farmers are women. So they make up the largest proportion of those farm and ranch owners on the planet are smallholder farmers, and the largest proportion of those are by and large women. Agriculture is a woman's job in much of the world. That's something I don't know that we always think about here in the United States, because it's not the case here. Although we are seeing increasing numbers of women in agriculture, we don't have the 80% that many of the other places in the world have. There are state-owned farms. We see that in places where there are still an authoritative government can have a state-owned farm where people are either encouraged to work there, paid to work there, or sometimes those are also authoritative where people are being misused in order to provide the labor. But those are government-controlled farms. Commercial farms are those that are out to have a profit. So the farm exists as a source of income to the people who are either the single sole entity owners, an LLC, whether that's a group of individuals who've come together, whether that's a larger corporation who owns a farm, but that's a commercial farm seeks to make profit. So whoever controls the farm wants it to be profitable. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think for those that rely on agriculture for their income, having a commercial farm is important, because that is where money comes from. And we also have, as that final category, an example in this type of bucket is a family farm. Now, family farms aren't necessarily smallholder farms, especially in the United States. In fact, somewhere around 96% of the farms in the United States are owned by families. So they're considered family farms. They can be very small family farms that would also be considered smallholder farms, or they can be very large farms that are still owned and managed within a family. So as we think about all of these terms, the thought is that this week we're going to let you do a deeper dive into one of these types. We'll talk later in the semester about what is being farmed and how there's differences based on the specific needs of the crops or animals. We grow chickens very differently than we raise dairy cattle or beef cattle. We raise rice much differently than we raise grapes for wine, or we raise wheat, or we raise any of the other cropping systems. So there's a whole category we won't talk about in the next 2 weeks that is how we raise specific commodities. So this week you do have an assignment. Your job is to select one of the farming systems from the list in Canvas. You'll click on that page and it should allow you to edit by just putting your name in a box. Now there are 4 boxes per farming system. So you can go in, and if you'd like to do authoritative control farms, the 4 of you can do that, but it is an individual assignment. So even though there's 4 people who can pick that, it doesn't necessarily mean that those 4 people work together to submit one presentation. Every person should submit their own presentation. You're going to make some sort of a multimedia presentation. So think Canva, Google Slides, PowerPoint. You don't need to do a voiceover, talk, and narrate your presentation. Just make the slides and include where the system was first implemented, what environmental or cultural implications led to why the system exists. For example, we have nomadic herding. Why does nomadic herding exist? What about the system makes it a good option for the places where it happens? Specifically, what made it a good choice for where it first originated? And then, what are the benefits of using that system? And what are some of the potential challenges in using that system? I would anticipate that with a title slide, you probably need to have 6 to 7 slides to be complete. And as much as I love watching all of your hard work, please don't make these more than 10 slides long. So a maximum of 10 slides. So 6 to 7 should be able to get it done. Maximum of 10 slides. You'll submit your presentation in one of a couple of forms. You can upload your whole presentation. So if you make a PowerPoint and save it, just upload that into the Canva system. Or you can submit a link to the presentation if you make a Canva or a Google slide. Pro tip. Please make sure if you're submitting a link to that presentation that you have double or triple checked to make sure that everybody who has the link can actually access it. Share the link with a friend who's not logged into your Google account or your Canva account and make sure they can click and see the whole thing. If you're in Canva, the public view link is the very best option. And if you're in Google Slides, make sure that you go down to Manage Access and ensure everyone with the link can view. We'll reach out to you if we can't see it, but unfortunately, if we don't have a link that works within one ask, we may have to count that as late as we look at the time that we need to make sure that we can score all of these. Best way to get around that, just make sure that you check and ensure that the link you submit, if you're submitting a link, has the ability for anybody to open it so that we can see your great work. That's all we have for this week. Next week, we're going to dig into these farming systems a little bit more in depth. As a reminder, the glossary that's posted in this week's module includes a bunch of terms that we should all be familiar with as we move forward and talk about agriculture through the ages. So the quiz for this week comes directly from the glossary. There are 20 questions that are about comparing some of the differences between some of those terms and definitions of those terms, but not just a straight match definition to the term. There are some actual questions about how those terms work. So with that, presentation is due next Monday on the 27th, and that should be the date that you complete your quiz by. As always, if you have any questions, you're having trouble accessing things, you want some clarification, let me know. The assignment link also includes the full rubric and how we will score your farming systems presentation. Have a fantastic week. Let me know what questions you have, and we will see you soon.